I suppose with this film, we tried to make something that you could watch again, find different connections, find different emotional resonances. And certainly, I mean, obviously, as the filmmaker, I can't tell you how many times I've watched this film. And it always strikes me that the emotional hit, the emotional power of a film comes at very different moments for me. The thing that I say in the theatre, the most important thing a director has to do, obviously one needs to frantically worry about narrative and frantically worry about rhythm and emotional arcs and everything else. But the other thing you need to do is to make sure everybody's actually in the same production. In a sense, that is similar as well in a film. I think that you do need to make sure everyone's actually in the same film. With this story, it's a complex challenge just because you're dealing with 3 very different time periods and 3 different storylines altogether. Trying to make sure that the emotional arc, the narrative arc, and the thematic arc of those stories meant that they became one film, perhaps was my greatest challenge. I also find that, you know, we worked very hard on this film to give it a complexity that is truthful to how people actually live their lives, to the very acute and profound choices that people make and the cost of those choices in the search for happiness. I do think that all 3 women are desperately searching to find light at the end of what appears to be a very dark tunnel, and are given it in this film. And I think that the fantastic nature of David Hare's very brilliant screenplay that allows you to keep investigating and keep exploring this material as you watch it again and again will be and is a huge gift on DVD.
And action!
I spent most of my life in the theatre, and luckily enough, of course, most of the actors, in fact, all of the actors in this film have spent a good amount of the time in the theatre, some more than others, but everybody at some point has spent time working in that particular medium. The advantage there is that you have a shared methodology and a shared approach, and certainly a shared language of investigation into a text. With the casting of Virginia Woolf, Nicole was the first choice of both Scott Rudin, the producer, and myself. Nicole had always struck me as being a genuinely transforming actress. The great thing about her is that, well, what we wanted with Virginia is a contemporary, somebody who felt part of our generation, part of our world, not a literary figure lost in the mists of time, but somebody who was speaking directly to us now. And Nicole has this extraordinary danger, and many people describe her as feral, almost has a sort of unpredictability, a danger, an extraordinary emotional depth to her.
Okay. Turn over. Rolling. Action.
I think Nicole was nervous about playing Virginia Woolf, and nervous to the point where she wanted to pull out, in fact, before we started shooting. We managed to persuade her to stay with the project. And of course, once she arrived, she was extraordinarily diligent. We'd never wanted to impersonate or imitate Virginia Woolf, but find our own Virginia Woolf that was right for us and right for Nicole.
Cameras cut! Slow off!
Meryl's worked with this woman, Anne Roth, on a number of occasions, who I only had the chance to work with on the hours. She was the costume designer, but she's so much more than that. And she said, you know, we were thinking about this, maybe. She sort of did that. And then she would walk around the room a bit, and I'd look at her and I think, God, that sort of looks right for Virginia. And we just did some makeup tests, and in that test period, we explored some things, and out of that came sort of her face. Mm-hmm. And it wasn't to try and look like the images of Virginia, just as I don't do Virginia's voice, because if you hear Virginia's accent or her voice now, it would be comical.
I think we started rehearsing and started to test different elements, like we started looking at shoes and clothes and hair, and And the nose, as it were, the prosthetic, came out of that conversation. It was never an issue that we would, Nicole, we'd like you to do this part, but you've got to wear a nose. Came out of what would be good for Nicole, and it seemed to be almost a releasing mechanism for her to lose herself, to bury herself in this character.
It's so subtle. It's really not a big change, but it's the work that's enhanced by this little adjustment, and it's gorgeous work. It really is.
Yeah, and the transformation is wholly emotional. It's not, we don't want to harp on the physical thing because it really is an emotional face she creates. You know, I mean, that's what it is.
It's true. The whole
No, it's true.
person.
6:40, take one.
Julianne Moore was always in our heads and always in our conversation, and certainly for me, she felt like I couldn't imagine anybody better to play that role, and she knew the book incredibly well. So when we came to rehearse and when we came to shoot, she had this extraordinary depth of knowledge about Michael Cunningham's book, and so had really digested and made a series of choices that then we discussed and explored again.
I'm just talking about, okay, so he did his mummy.
Then you cut.
Okay.
Till you get right the way around, then you get in the car, then he says, Mummy, I don't want to go.
Right.
And then there's the return.
Okay.
This section, it's just the very beginning.
And then you move around here for that. Great. Excellent.
The rehearsal process is one where you start off not on set, you're starting in a rehearsal room, and you will have certain elements that you need in the rehearsal room. There's a starting point, certain elements of furniture, and a ground plan. That's something literally marked out on the floor, no real walls yet, and with tape of what the apartment or the room or the street might be. And you mark it out, and you try to find the very simple, basic physical language, in other words, the very simple physical relationship between the characters that will reveal the drama.
I'm gonna make the cake for Daddy's birthday.
Mommy, I want to help.
Well,
Can I help make the cake?
of course you can, sweetie. I'm not gonna do anything without you. Go again right away, please.
Julianne doesn't like rehearsing. I mean, I think a lot of the rehearsals I did, which were behaviorally based and again about how to stage the scene, we would do quite simply so that Julianne never felt that we were blowing the casket or letting the air out of it, that she would save herself up in terms of her performance for when we actually started shooting. And it was a fantastic surprise and a huge treat to start shooting with Julianne.
Shortening.
I always hate it when I have to cry, because it's exhausting, you know? And we all had a lot of that. It's something I like to watch. I'll run to a movie where women are crying. I love it, you know? But when you have to do it,
I know.
it's really draining.
Yeah.
You know?
When I first had a conversation with Scott Rudin, he said, what do you feel about Meryl Streep? And I said, I would die to work with Meryl Streep. That would just be such a fantastic treat. Meryl has an extraordinary facility. Whenever an actor goes through the scenes that Meryl has to go through, it costs. There's no two ways about it. It costs you. It costs you physically, as well as emotionally, the reserves that you're actually literally using up. There's a scene, for example, where she breaks down in the kitchen, which we had to do for many hours, and she kept on going and kept on going. We kept on exploring and kept on seeing what else we could find.
Oh, God.
Do you want me to go?
No, don't go.
She also works, I think, behaviorally. So she enjoys trying to find the behavioral language of the character to almost distract her, to surprise herself.
My God, what if nobody comes?
Once we'd established that, then we would try to do things that allowed surprising things to happen in the scene that one could react off intuitively rather than in any planned sense. There's a moment, for example, in the scene with Jeff Daniels, where a tap goes on and a huge chute of water comes out.
Clarissa?
That's an accident, which Meryl played off so brilliantly that it felt fantastic to keep that in. One of the funny things is that Meryl seemed to always have a problem with doors, getting in and out of the doors, and that became a sort of running joke on set is that you know, there were so many times when she couldn't get in a door, or the door wouldn't open, or she couldn't get out of the door.
Yes. Well,
Do you want it slower?
I think as a director, you're always you know, any actor that you're working with, you need to find a particular and very personal relationship and context in which you can work, and that is never the same twice.
Action.
And Nicole works incredibly intuitively, very emotionally, and particularly with this part, it's trying to find an emotional context and landscape which she can stay in, and obviously sometimes would have to stay in for long periods of time, like a whole day.
It's been ridiculous in London. Ridiculous? How? Sorry. Should we start again?
6:43, take 2.
A scene, for example, where Nicole is bereft at her sister leaving, and this extraordinary emotional intensity and vulnerability that Nicole found, partly aided, as she would say, I think, by her own particular personal circumstances at that time of just going through a divorce. Trying to allow Nicole to go there and trying to sustain her there requires her, inevitably, to have huge trust in the process that you're engaged in. You take her by the hand and lead her through into this complex emotional landscape that she can exist in for the shoot. And she was incredibly brave at going on that journey. And little Jack, I was looking for someone, obviously, that would match Ed, and Ed has these extraordinary eyes, and we needed a little boy with equally extraordinary eyes, that somehow you could sort of imagine that the little boy would grow into Ed. And little Jack was a very sensitive little soul, it seemed to me. But obviously he's playing a crucial part and a very huge part in this story, and the journey that the child will go on is very different from the journey that Julianne Moore was going to go on, and they spent an awful lot of time together. So they had very different acting experiences and very different working methodologies, obviously. He's going to blow out the candles, yeah, and then you give it a little clap, yeah? Happy, and you just say, happy birthday.
Happy birthday. No, it's happy birthday, Dad.
Just, yeah, you can say, happy birthday, Dad. Yeah?
That's what it's in the script.
Okay. You can't talk to a 6-year-old necessarily about character. But we don't sing happy birthday, we just say happy birthday, Dad. Yeah?
What's it here?
Butter.
Butter. And what are we having for dinner?
We've had lamb. You know, her Jack, you know, in the scene, you think your mother might be going off and she's in danger and she might be going to kill herself, and you sort of get, you know, it's probably not a great way of going about accessing the child. Because it's all about how your dad met your mum.
I don't want to eat lamb.
You eat lamb. So you find different routes in. An example of that would be there's a birthday party scene.
Happy birthday!
It tells you the story. And look at Mum, okay? You've got to look at Mum.
What is the story?
And you've got to wait and hear it. What most of the time little Jack is listening to is not a hugely warm and affectionate and complex speech by John C. Reilly. He's listening to either John or me or the associate producer, Ian McNeil, telling him fairy stories. So most of the time, you'll see the child reacting and looking and, with love or awe, but actually what he's literally responding to is me saying, well, and then Jack and the Beanstalk, and Jack was climbing up this huge beanstalk, and it was getting really scary, and then he found the golden egg, and you can see these looks on the kid. It just takes an awful lot of patience until you try to find the reaction that you might be able to use, which you need to know, but the child doesn't necessarily need to know, that you'll use actually in the final film.
He's deeply unsentimental in his filmmaking, which I think benefits this film, because if you'd had a huge amount of sentiment, I think the film wouldn't have worked.
Is it a she?
Do you think she'll like
People often ask, what do you bring from the theatre, you know, into film? I think you sort of bring an awareness of knowing how to work with actors, a narrative rhythm that you have to be quite strict with yourself in the theatre, and simply how to stage scenes. An awareness of dramatic action and how that dramatic action reveals character. Keep your direction forward, yeah?
Okay.
Rather than playing the anxiety of the water.
Right.
Do that physically, but don't do that mentally.
Okay.
For example, in suggesting to Meryl if a lot of the emotion in the scene is actually expressed through breaking eggs. This very rhythmic action of cracking and separating eggs at the moment that she has the conversation. In the back of my head, I also sort of knew that later down the line, I'd probably be using eggs in Virginia Woolf, and I would probably keep the idea of food in some way. But we shot that first, and so that was then the leitmotif that I would carry on with in the different periods and the different shoots as we came to them. In the railway station scene, I was very keen to keep the actors apart for as long as I could, knowing that they were going to get incredibly intimate and close and exposed with each other. So that when they do come together, you can feel the physical potency and the power of that emotional and indeed physical connection that develops throughout the film.
It is mine and mine alone. It is not. It is mine. I am dying in this town.
Virginia, if you were thinking...
I was very keen that the camera movement should never be decorative. And when I say decorative, it shouldn't elicit an emotional response that the actor was not necessarily in charge of. I think it's particularly apparent where the last scene between Julianne Moore and Meryl Streep, and we discussed inevitably a series of camera moves that were possible within that. You know, those inevitable push-ins. You get the push-in of the intensification of the emotion. When you have the strength of those extraordinary actors doing that extraordinary work, totally ludicrous to add in some sort of move that would only be self-conscious in terms of the filmmaking.
I was really blown away when I saw this movie, and I mean, you hope something is going to be good. You sort of lay down your life for it in your own little segment, but you don't know how it's going to turn out, and it was just, oh, it's beautiful.
It was magical to see us all connected like that and to share a movie with these two great women. I mean, that was something that you're so proud of, and I actually sent them both flowers because I sat in the movie going, oh my God, I can't believe that, that we have this, because it's about something, it really speaks, and people are reacting to it in such a strong way, so it's not just...
It's not just us, we don't...
No, we're sitting here, I promise you it's not.
What we have done.
Trying to get the, so much shot in it. I mean, it was not a huge budget, and that's, you know, what you...
Trying to get it right.
Yeah, very long hours,
I
weren't
suddenly
they?
thought why they called it the hours.
Yes, we went very, very long hours. We spent on the set. That's right.
So there was no life besides
That was
this.
part of the difficulty.
Yeah,
The hours.
long hours on the hours.
Certainly the experience of doing the hours has been a transformative experience for me. It's been something that I've cherished and something that has genuinely challenged and surprised and expanded my horizons. The process of the score was a long and lengthy one. We were putting on a whole variety of different test scores onto the film, and just trying to see what the film itself would speak to and would yield to. And the film was rejecting everything. Everything that was traditional film score seemed to reduce or simplify or sentimentalize what were layered subtextual emotions.
We all knew from the very start that this was a fantastically difficult film to score because it is not in a genre. A composer takes his cue from the idea of what kind of film is this. But this film isn't any particular kind. What we're really talking about is someone who, rather than writing what's called program music, is a composer in his own right. I would say there only are 3 or 4 in the world. And I think, obviously, Philip is the preeminent example among those.
We kept on referring back in our temp score to Philip Glass, who was not on board at the time, and it seemed an incredible stroke of luck and when he finally agreed to write the whole score for us.
This is a movie about art. It's about how art affects life, which is, well, would you agree it's a little bit rare? We don't come across that very much. I liked it right away, and I said, oh, this is a very, very interesting movie with a lot of quality in it, both in the writing and the directing and the acting and everything. It's a very challenging job for a composer because we'll say, how is the music going to function in this? And it looked to me, as I saw it even the very first time, that what the music had to do was to somehow convey the structure of the film. The story is very complicated, and the music could take on a very important role in the film as I saw it. To make it viewable, to make it comprehensible, so the stories didn't seem separate, so that the stories was tied together. So the music, it seemed to me, had to be the thread that would tie the movie together. You might have thought you could have a different music for each of the periods. And I said, no, I wouldn't do it that way. I wrote the same music to go through all three. As those characters reappear, variations of these themes appear, and so you have the feeling that the music at the beginning really is the music that you hear all through the film. When you first hear it, it seems to start and to stop. And the next time you hear it, it just keeps going. And it's that feeling that you get in the morning where you're not quite sure you're awake yet. And the music does that too. It kind of starts and stops, and then it goes on and it stops, and goes on and stops, and then it gets going. And then it just keeps going. It's kind of, maybe many of us had that feeling in the morning. I'll just play a little bit of it. I chose the piano because I wanted an instrument that was very personal, that could cross periods very easily. The piano can do that. And I combined it with a large string orchestra to give it a kind of a density and weight of sound. In the same way that we're looking back through time. We're looking back and forward at the same time. At the very end, we hear the Virginia Woolf character, Nicole Kidman, is talking about facing life and how she has to face life. For her, committing suicide wasn't a tragic event. It was an act of volition which would complete her life in a way. It's an idea that comes up in Japanese literature more than in Western literature, that taking a life can be a fulfillment of a life, can be the completion of a life. So it wasn't done as an act of desperate unhappiness or insanity. It was done in a very different way, so that the music does not have to echo a conventional idea of death. It's more of an existential idea of choice. There's no question that the emotional point of view is conveyed by the music. Images are surprisingly neutral. Not that they don't have an emotional content of their own, but they can be easily manipulated depending on the music. So that the direction the music takes, it's like it's the arrow that you shoot in the air. Everything follows that.
What's fantastic is that Philip's work is incredibly complex. It works as a sort of another stream of consciousness within the film, almost as another character that links, complicates, and expands any particular scene that we're in. And there is a sort of gap sometimes between the image and the music, so that there is a counterpoint between the two. And I think he's written one of the great scores.
Part of what I love about Wolf is her sense of the singularity and preciousness and beauty of every minute, every hour.
I've spent my whole life wanting to see women's lives, not prioritized over men's, but all my own work has been to do with exploring the lives of modern women.
Coming from a English literature background through my education, yeah, I was very aware of Virginia Woolf and of course knew Mrs. Dalloway. And so, having always been a fan of Virginia Woolf, it was another fantastic reason to engage in this extraordinary material.
It all started when I was 15 years old. I was in high school in Los Angeles, and I didn't really care much about writing or even really much about books. I wasn't actively opposed to books. I just wasn't very much interested in them. I went to the library, the bookmobile, the Band-Aid colored trailers on the cinder blocks where they kept the books, and they had one book by Virginia Woolf, Mrs. Dalloway. I was the only one who'd ever checked it out. I gamely took it home and tried to read it. I didn't know what it was about. I was 15, and a not especially precocious 15 at that. It didn't make any sense to me. But, I did get a sense of the density and music and beauty of those sentences. It hadn't really occurred to me that you could do that with language. And I remember thinking, oh, she was doing with words, with language, something like what Jimi Hendrix does with a guitar. Here's what it's about. A middle-aged, upper-class London woman runs some errands on a day in June.
Peter, Peter, cried Clarissa, following him out onto the landing. My party tonight.
Has a conversation with a man she might have married but didn't.
Clarissa, and could have bitten her tongue for thus reminding Peter that he had wanted to marry her.
Takes a nap and gives a boring party.
It was too much of an effort. She was not enjoying it. It was too much like being just
That's the story.
Standing there.
It is an ordinary day in the life of an ordinary person as told by a genius. By the end of Mrs. Dalloway, you understand that everything you need to know about human life is actually contained in every day of every human life. And I always wanted to do something with it about her, the way you want to write about your first love. I started out to write a simple, sort of updated version of Mrs. Dalloway about a sort of society hostess in New York City today. And I spent a few months on it, and it was going along just fine until I realized that, it was just a conceit. It wasn't really enough to write a novel about. We already have Mrs. Dalloway. Why would we need a modernized version? I was sitting at my computer, just about ready to kiss it goodbye, and I had this image of Mrs. Dalloway standing in front of Virginia Woolf, standing in front of my mother. Mom, Mom, what are you doing here? And I added a character based on my mother, though not my mother, the character Laura Brown. Her cake's a failure, but she's loved anyway. She's loved, she thinks, in more or less the way the gifts will be appreciated, because they've been given with good intentions, because they exist. And then somehow, suddenly it fell into place. Then it was 3 different days in the lives of 3 different women, a writer, a reader, and a character. And then all I had to do was write the book.
Michael Cunningham brilliantly keeps you interested in all 3 stories without you yet understanding the way in which they connect.
It feels almost like a thriller. And of course, when those narrative twists arrive, I think that certainly in my experience of it, and certainly to me, it is still quite shocking that you realize, oh my God.
And it started to sell and sold more and more in the months before the Pulitzer Prize was announced.
Scott Rudin had bought the book before. I think he bought it in galleys, as he does. He gets hold of books incredibly early and was drawn to it from the very start.
I'd rather there be no movie made out of the hours than a bad movie. But I talked to Scott Rudin and had great feelings about his intelligence and insight. And he got David Hare interested in writing the screenplay. And at that point I thought, great.
Michael Cunningham came to me originally with an incredibly generous offer of trust, which was, he said, look, I have taken these 3 stories and I have mixed them together in a way that pleases me. And he said, now you must do whatever you wish to do with these 3 stories.
David would ask me questions like, Michael, Clarissa, does she have big breasts? And I said, well, no, I don't think she, I thought not. Now, Sally, do you think she and Sally have much sex? I said, no, I don't think so. I thought not. It wasn't all about sex and breasts, but it was about fleshing out the people in his mind. It was about understanding their lives outside of the book.
I have traveled a long way from Michael's book, but the only way fidelity is achieved in adaptation is through promiscuity. And that at the end of it all, it's not very different from the book, although it's completely reconceived. And I hope Michael will feel that it's true to the spirit of the book.
It's a terrible thing, Miss Vaughn, to outlive your whole family.
Richard's father died.
Yes, he died of cancer quite young. And Richard's sister is dead.
And the script was actually, I think, almost finished. I think it was finished, or I regarded it as finished, when Stephen Daldry arrived. And so he was hired as director after the script had been developed. But then what was wonderful was having somebody fresh come to it.
I come from the theatre. I'm used to writers being around right the way through the whole process, and so David has been involved with Scott, obviously, and myself, right the way through the whole process.
I've not felt remotely disposable. But I, anyway, like working with actors. And so on those mornings when I could face the trek out to the studio, I would go out, see the rehearsal, look at what the actors were doing. And if you have great actors, if you're working, with Meryl Streep and Julianne Moore and Nicole Kidman, leading a cast of equals, then any intelligent writer is going to look at a rehearsal and say, I can do this slightly differently, I can add this, I don't need that. When I see what this actor can give me here, I can change it. And so quite a lot of the time, I was working to change it according to what the actor gives you, which is, for me, the fun of film writing.
I got that title, The Hours, directly from Woolf herself. It was the working title of Mrs. Dalloway.
And so the book was originally called The Hours, and then she changed the title as she was going along.
In a sense, the character that talks about what the hours are to them is Ed Harris's character, Richard. And he talks about how one gets through the hours. What are the hours about, and can he survive the hours that are yet to come?
It's one thing to have ideas about what you're determined to be or do, but the place where you actually have to live those ideas are the hours. That's where we live. We live in the hours.
I hope that my books, and I hope the movie too, gives people a sense of companionship. That's what I look for in books. That's what I look for as a reader.
The film is a film that celebrates life with all its complexity and with all its difficulty and with all its tragedy, but in the end is a film that says, moving forward with life, life itself is the most powerful and wonderful thing that we have.
It's clear from the evidence that Virginia Woolf could be described as manic-depressive. And who knows, if she had had lithium, she might have lived longer. We don't know that. She did alternate between periods of mania and high excitement and periods of very inert depression. She suffered terribly from sleeplessness. She had appalling headaches. I mean, these are not just headaches as you and I know them, but these are really terrible, incapacitating headaches. She clearly suffered tremendously from a lot of physical pain all through her life. And I think her life is a story of great courage and stoicism.
Two days ago, Sunday the 16th of April, 1939 to be precise, Nessa said that if I did not start writing my memoirs, I should soon be too old. There are several difficulties. In the first place, the enormous number of things I can remember. Many bright colors, many distinct sounds, some human beings, caricatures, comic, several violent moments of being, always including a circle of the scene which they cut out, and all surrounded by a vast space. That is a rough visual description of childhood. This is how I shape it, and how I see myself as a child.
Virginia Woolf was born in London. Her parents were Leslie and Julia Stephen. Her mother was descended from an Anglo-Indian family. The women in the family were famous for their beauty, and something of that Virginia Woolf inherited. Her father, Leslie Stephen, who became Sir Leslie Stephen, was an eminent author and editor. He edited 26 volumes of the Dictionary of National Biography. He was really at the very center of the English literary establishment.
Her father and her mother were both on second marriages. They were both widowed. They were much older than the group of children that started with Vanessa. Then there was Toby, Virginia, and Adrian. So she grew up with parents, she said, who were really the age of grandparents.
And her mother, Julia, had had two sons by her previous marriage, George and Gerald Duckworth. One of these two brothers has become notorious because later on in life, Virginia Woolf wrote a memoir in which she suggested that George Duckworth had sexually molested her as a child.
There was obviously some very traumatic sexual interference going on. And there is a school of thought that argues that her life is dominated by childhood sexual abuse. I am not of that opinion because I don't read her life as that of a victim.
She grew up in a very Victorian household, despite the fact she was born in 1882, very, very near the end of the century. And she basically, until the death of her father, lived under quite Victorian circumstances and disliked them intensely.
By nature, both Vanessa and I were explorers, revolutionists, reformers. But our surroundings were at least 50 years behind the times. Father himself was a typical Victorian.
Virginia Woolf's whole political argument, which had to do with the unfair treatment of women in British society in the early 20th century, was based on the fact that she didn't go to school and she didn't go to university. She was burningly resentful of the fact that she was self-taught and that she didn't have an education like her brothers.
Was I clever, stupid, good-looking, ugly, passionate, cold? Owing partly to the fact that I was never at school, never competed in any way with children of my own age, I have never been able to compare my gifts and defects with other people's.
She was very close, particularly to her sister, because both her brothers were sent away to school, but she remained at home. And her sister, Vanessa, very early on decided she wanted to be a painter, and Virginia, perhaps wanting also to have a route, decided that she was to be the writer.
I think she probably started writing about the age of 3 and was writing non-stop and unstoppably all through her life, from the minute she could hold a pencil until the day she walked in the river.
She was also a superb artist, as it turned out, and one of the real phenomena of that family was how these two daughters both came out as highly significant artists.
Her mother died when Virginia was 13. This was an absolute catastrophe in her life.
We had been sent up to the day nursery after she died and were crying. How that early morning picture has stayed with me.
The first serious bout of mental illness which Virginia Woolf underwent happened soon after her mother's death, at the age of around 13.
There was the moment of the puddle in the path, when for no reason I could discover, everything suddenly became unreal. I was suspended. I could not step across the puddle. I tried to touch something. The whole world became unreal.
Then immediately her half-sister, to whom she was very close, Stella, died. And then her father died. I mean, it is a sort of staggering succession of blows.
Virginia Woolf had serious and very debilitating attacks of mental illness throughout her life. They came at times of great stress. She was visited by voices. She was incapable of getting up, working or looking after herself.
And those voices for her were about it. They were masculine voices. They told her she was worthless. They told her she was terrible.
She spent her whole life, actually, coming to terms with the deaths of her parents, trying to prove herself to them. There's a scene in a novel by Virginia Woolf called Mrs. Dalloway, where the grown-up Mrs. Dalloway imagines herself carrying her life in her arms as if it's a baby, and walking towards her parents, who are both dead in the novel, and putting this thing down in front of them and saying, "This is my life, this is what I've made of it." And I always feel that's autobiographical, and that's what Virginia was always doing when she was writing. She was proving herself to her dead parents.
And it was in 1904 that the Stevens family, Vanessa, Virginia, Toby, Adrian, moved from the Victorian house in Hyde Park Gate to Bloomsbury, then an area that was not considered to be a good place to live. They set up home there, invited their friends, and the place became a meeting point for artists, writers, intellectuals.
We were full of experiments and reforms. We were going to do without table napkins. We were going to paint, to write, to have coffee after dinner instead of tea at 9 o'clock. Everything was going to be new. Everything was going to be different. Everything was on trial.
Virginia's elder brother was called Toby Stephen, and he's a crucial character in the story of both Virginia Woolf's life and of Bloomsbury, because when he left Cambridge, he began holding at-homes at their house in 46 Gordon Square in Bloomsbury, and he invited his Cambridge friends to those events.
The Bloomsbury Group was never a club, it was just a collection of friends.
It consisted of Toby Stephen and his serious young philosophical and literary friends from Cambridge, who were mostly gay or bisexual. Lytton Strachey, Duncan Grant, and so on. And they all sat around discussing the nature of good.
They were very aware that the Victorians had placed a great deal of attention on public life, and these friends wanted to turn that kind of investigation on personal lives, private lives, on the understanding that only if there was intellectual honesty close at hand could you hope to achieve it in the public sphere.
And in the pursuit of truth, conventions, where they were mere conventions, were there to be ignored, to be torn up, to be challenged.
If someone departs from a convention today, people hardly raise an eyebrow, but you could be damned in Vanessa and Virginia's day simply by, a lack of an inch on the length of your skirt. So in that setting, they were very bold.
The Bloomsbury Group was quite wonderfully omnisexual. Everybody had relations with everybody else. A lot of people hated them, regarded them as very exclusionary, as elite, also as lascivious and immoral, which is kind of fun to think about now.
The Stephen family went on holiday to Greece in the summer of 1906. And while they were abroad, both Toby and Vanessa fell ill. Toby came back to London a little before the rest of the party. He was thought to be getting better, but suddenly he died. He'd contracted typhoid. And his death had an extraordinary effect on these siblings because it drew them all suddenly that much closer.
Virginia and Vanessa and their brother Adrian were completely desolated by this death. Vanessa's reaction was to get married to one of Toby's closest friends. It was almost like a replacement. Virginia lost her brother, and she also, as it were, lost her sister, pretty much at the same time. And she was distraught, absolutely distraught. The marriage between Virginia Stephen and Leonard Woolf, which started in 1912 and lasted for the whole of the rest of her life, was, I think, a very good marriage. It was a marriage which began in total desperation because the minute they got married, she became extremely ill, and you can draw your own conclusions from that. Clearly, her illness was triggered by the new situation, by the shock of having to come to terms with being a sexual being, a sexual partner. It seems clear that they did not have a normal, if that's the word you want to use, or continuing sex life. For a period of about 3 years, on and off, she was incarcerated, she was under the care of nurses, she tried to kill herself, and she was heavily treated with sedative drugs and with a rest cure treatment, which was a very fashionable one at the time.
You were put in a dark room. You were made to drink milk and eat animal fat. So they were to be left in the dark, not allowed to talk to anybody, read or write.
When Virginia went off her head, which she did about 4 times in her life, it was a total transformation. She was insulting and cruel to the people she loved the most, like Leonard Woolf. She spat at people. She thought that Edward VII was coming to dinner when he'd been dead for 20 years.
She also had periods of mania, of very, very high, exhilarated peak periods where she talked wonderfully and sometimes wrote wonderfully.
And then gradually she emerged from this extraordinary traumas and was able to say, as she did in one of her letters or her diary, it's really great fun being mad. You have the most wonderful ideas, better than you do when you're sane. But it wasn't fun for her or for anybody else when it was happening.
Although as a writer she was very good at portraying the instability of the mind and the way it flits this way and that and catches on some things and jumps over others.
I begin to loathe my kind, principally from looking at their faces in the tube. Really, raw red beef and silver herrings give me more pleasure to look upon.
Leonard felt it was the stress of modern life that was the cause of some of Virginia's breakdowns. He moved to Richmond, to Hogarth House, where he felt she would be less likely to become overexcited by society.
She didn't publish her first novel until 1915, when she was 33, and this was because she had worked at it and worked at it and worked at it all through her 20s, all through her period of mental breakdown. It had been a fantastically difficult novel for her to write. This was the novel called The Voyage Out, because it was about her childhood and the loss of her mother and her becoming an adult.
When Virginia Woolf was still trying to write her first novel, her sister entered upon a very radical period as a painter and cut out detail and representation. She began painting portraits of people where the face is left empty. It was a suddenly very daring method of representation because these portraits do convey character. And Virginia was intrigued and I think gradually began to wonder if the same thing could happen in literature.
She was really attempting to describe people's relationships, not in the way that they talk to each other or behave to each other, but what they didn't say to each other, what was in their minds. It is the method which has become known as the stream of consciousness, the body language without the body.
The day after my birthday, in fact I'm 38, and happier today than I was yesterday, having this afternoon arrived at some idea of a new form for a novel. For I figure that the approach will be entirely different this time. No scaffolding, scarcely a brick to be seen, all crepuscular, but the heart, the passion, humour, everything as bright as fire in the mist.
The Woolfs founded their own printing press and their own publishing house called the Hogarth Press in 1916 when they were in Richmond, and the basement of the house in Richmond was the office of the press. This was very, very important for Virginia Woolf because it meant she could publish her own work. It also meant she could publish little books, little sketches, little stories, things like Kew Gardens and The Mark on the Wall, with beautiful covers done by Vanessa. And it freed her up to be an experimental writer.
On Sunday, Leonard read through Jacob's Room. He thinks it my best work, unlike any other novel. Neither of us knows what the public will think. There's no doubt in my mind that I have found out how to begin, at 40, to say something in my own voice.
From 1919, the Woolfs lived in Sussex as well as in London. They bought a rather small, quite ordinary little cottage called Monk's House in the village of Rodmill.
Virginia Woolf wrote mostly in her garden shed, which she called my lodge. And sometimes she would sit at a table there, but very often she would write standing up. She had a special desk made for somebody on their feet, you see. And it was in that lodge that she really composed the greater part of her novels. It was her sanctum.
The Sussex landscape was extremely important to Virginia Woolf. She walked all the time. She was a great walker like her father. And you can imagine her striding over the downs, wearing a sort of terrible old hat and shouting out loud the next paragraph of her novel, because she used to talk out loud to get the rhythm of the sentences.
She had no children of her own, and so she adopted for a very short period at a time other people's children. Her nephew and niece, of course, and Vita's children, my brother and myself. And when she was coming to stay at Longbourn, my mother would say, "Virginia's coming for the night." Our immediate reaction was, "Oh, good."
Everybody said, "Oh, hooray, Virginia's coming to tea, now we shall enjoy ourselves," because she was very enlivening, inspiriting.
And then she would sit us down and interrogate us. I remember once she said, "What has happened to you this morning?" And I would reply, "Well, nothing." "Oh, come on," she would say. "What woke you up?" And I would reply, "It was the sun coming through our bedroom window." "What sort of a sun?" she would say. "A kindly sun? Angry sun?" We would answer that in some way. Then she was fascinated by the detail of how we dressed. Of course, what she was doing was gathering copy.
She loved nothing so much but to have people that she liked come to tea and to quiz them and to ask them every single detail about their lives. And that intense curiosity is obviously part of what makes her a novelist.
Perhaps her most important female friend was her sister Vanessa. But after that, it would have been the writer Vita Sackville-West.
She was my mother's most intimate friend. In fact, for a short period, they were lovers.
Virginia Woolf loved women. She was a married woman, deeply involved in her marriage. It was a marriage which left space for very intense, even erotic relations with other women.
Woolf's own activities included this rather formidable body of feminist work on the question of the intellectual status of women. And this exchange gave rise to a number of writings, finally A Room of One's Own, which was her most thought out version of the relation of women to writing and to questions of fame.
Set in Cambridge, she mocks the institution that wouldn't allow her, a woman, to enter a university library where her father had given manuscripts.
For here again we come within range of that very interesting and obscure masculine complex which has had so much influence on the women's movement, that deep-seated desire, not so much that she shall be inferior as that he shall be superior.
Virginia Woolf often says, why should more attention be given to books about war or government or football as opposed to stories about women going shopping or making a meal?
Later on, she wrote an even more inflammatory book. It was published in 1938 called 3 Guineas, which was an indictment of both fascism and war from a feminist perspective. She and Leonard had gone to Germany in the late 30s, and I don't remember the date. They actually had gone on a motoring tour to see it for themselves.
Virginia Woolf and Leonard Woolf were very worried that in the event of invasion by the Germans that they would be imprisoned for their political work and because Leonard was a Jew.
They knew they were on Hitler's blacklist. They had made, actually, very practical suicide plans in case of an invasion. She was extremely despairing about her final book, Between the Acts, and felt that she'd lost her talent. She felt useless in wartime. She felt that the role of the writer, the novelist, was something that seemed to have no point anymore.
They were constantly, when the war started, being bombed and strafed by German planes. And the normality of being constantly under attack, the kind of stress, the kind of tension and horror that happened from this war day in and day out was an enormous, I think, part of her final decision to commit suicide.
She wasn't sleeping and she wasn't eating and she was beginning to border on hallucination. And I think she took a courageous, even a rational decision to end her life because she felt that she was going into a dark place and there might be no return from it.
She thought, well, I'm losing my wits. I can't keep it up, and I shall be a burden on Leonard. I can't go on, I can't pull myself together. And she drowned herself. And I think it was a brave thing to do.
It was an extraordinarily cruel, self-inflicted death, because she could swim very well. And the instinct of a person drowning must be to save themselves. She was wearing a heavy overcoat and put a stone in the pocket, but all the same, she forced herself to die in the cold water of the river. One of the most gallant, in a way, actions of our whole life.
There's been an enormous and wonderful industry of editing her posthumous work, you know, putting the essays and the letters and the diaries into marvelous editions. And this has meant that we see her as a much more muscular, prolific, energetic, strong, big writer than I think she was thought of at the time.
We've looked for a long time admiringly at her novels because they were experimental and they uncovered new methods and ways of doing things. But I think it's possible that in the long run, it may be that her diaries and her letters are what we most value. They have a texture to them, a richness of observation.
What sort of diary should I like mine to be? Something loose-knit and yet not slovenly, so elastic that it will embrace anything, solemn, slight, or beautiful that comes into my mind. I should like it to resemble some deep old desk, or capacious hold-all in which one flings a mass of odds and ends without looking them through. I should like to come back after a year or two and find that the collection had sorted itself and refined itself and coalesced, as such deposits so mysteriously do, into a mold, transparent enough to reflect the light of our life, and yet steady, tranquil compounds with the aloofness of a work of art.
She once said to me, nothing has really happened until it's been described. And she meant described in words. Therefore, she said, write a lot of letters to your family and friends. Keep a diary, she said. Don't let a day pass without recording it, whether anything interesting has happened or not. Something interesting happens every day, she said.
Your aunt's a very lucky woman, Angelica, because she has two lives. She has the life she's leading, also the book she's writing. Mrs. Dalloway said she would buy the flowers herself.
Mrs. Dalloway said she would buy the flowers herself.
Sally, I think I'll buy the flowers myself.
3 different women.
This life, it's what I've always wanted. I had an idea of our happiness.
Each living a lie.
I wish, for your sake, Leonard, I could be happy in this quietness.
Each putting someone else's life.
Good morning, Mrs. Dalloway.
First.
That is what we do. That is what people do. They stay alive for each other.
What about your own life? Just wait till I die. Then you'll have to think of yourself.
Mom, what's happening? He gives me that look to say, your life is so trivial. It only matters if you think it's true.
My life has been stolen from me.
Virginia, you have an obligation to your own sanity.
I am attended by doctors everywhere. I am attended by doctors who inform me of my own interests.
Baking the cake for Daddy to show him that we love him.
Otherwise, he won't know we love him.
That's right.
I don't know what's happening. I seem to be unraveling.
Come to bed, Laura Brown.
I remember one morning getting up at dawn. There was such a sense of possibility. And I remember thinking to myself, this is the beginning of happiness. I have lost those feelings forever.
Mommy, I love you.
Don't worry, honey. Everything's fine. You're my guy.
To look life in the face, to know it for what it is, to love it for what it is. It is the right of every human being.